welcome to Season 12, Episode 8 of the Ubuntu Podcast. I'm Mark, and joining me this week are the usual two, Alan.
Hello, Mark.
Hello, Alan. And also Martin.
Good evening.
Good evening to you, sir. What have you been doing of recent, Martin?
I have been migrating my Pebble watch to Rebble.
Ooh, I need to know more about this. Brain dump now.
Okay, so quick history lesson. Pebble was a successfully crowdfunded watch.
No, skip all that. Tell me how. Now.
And it got acquired by Fitbit and the services went away. But I think some employees or ex-employees of Pebble created Rebel.io. Which was to provide some continuity of service for people that owned Pebble watches. And I've done it, and it's pretty great.
How difficult was it to do?
Not difficult at all. It's a little bit clunky, but it's easy enough to do. So the basic ingredients are, in my case, I've got my Android phone, so I needed to have the Pebble app, the original Pebble app installed on my phone, which I did because I had been using it in the past. But if you don't have the Pebble app on your phone, if you go to rebel.io in their how-to section, they give you a link to the APK mirror where you can go and snag the APK for sideloading. And once you have that, and you've connected your phone to Pebble over Bluetooth, you connected your phone to the watch over Bluetooth, you then install the Rebel app, which is in the Play Store, on your phone. And this bounces you through some authentication. So it basically connects your either your Google account or your GitHub account or Twitter or Facebook or whatever to your Pebble account, and then apparently it looks like it sort of pokes in new back-end service URLs for the Pebble app to talk to the Rebel servers. So from that point onwards, you use the Pebble app just like you always used to for installing new watch faces, installing apps, getting updates, and doing all, managing your notifications and stuff like that. So it's just like it used to be.
Huh. That's brilliant.
Yeah. I noticed, so when I was talking to I got this idea from talking to people at Linux Fest Northwest. I thought it's finally time I did this.
There was a high proportion of Pebble users there, weren't there?
Yeah, it was good. Stood in a circle with 6 people and suddenly we all realised we were wearing Pebbles, which is typical for nerdy get-togethers, I think. But they were saying, the one thing it doesn't do is when you get a phone call, it says the number is unknown. But if you read the how-to page on Rebel.io, it says this is a known issue, and you install a companion app for your phone, and they give you the link to the Play Store, and then it says disable the notifications for the old phone calls bit, and this new app will then manage incoming phone call notifications, and it presents your phone numbers correctly. So, I've now gone and added some watch faces that I used to like, from the past that I'd lost access to. And I've added some apps that I liked, that, I didn't have anymore. And then there's a couple of things you can pay, and that accesses things like a diction service and weather services. And that's, I think, $3 a month if you want access to that. And that money goes to continuing to fund the Rebel.io services so that they can continue to operate them.
Nice.
Great.
Yeah. So if you've got a Pebble and you've not switched to Rebel.io, I can thoroughly recommend it. It's, just like it used to be. It's great.
Cool. Well, let's get on with the rest of the show. We mentioned in the news a few weeks ago that Microsoft have announced the next iteration of the Windows subsystem for Linux, WSL 2, and how this is going to ship a proper Linux kernel on Windows. and provide more compatibility and other interesting features for people who want to do Linuxy things. And in the meantime, Canonical have announced that Ubuntu will be supported on WSL 2. So we thought we'd talk about that a bit.
So have either of you used WSL at all?
No.
Easy answer from Martin. I have experimented with it at work, where we use Windows desktops, but we are targeting Linux. We're not actually targeting Ubuntu. We're targeting Red Hat, but it's, it would be nice if we could at least run the Linux versions of the software we're running on top of. But I hit some snags to do with it's kind of one way with the file system usage. You can't access stuff in the Linux file system from Windows stuff, but you can do it the other way around, and that makes it tricky to do things like running a server in the Linux side but editing code in an IDE on the Windows side. It all gets very complicated and a bit slow. And basically I found that while it's useful to have like a fully featured bash shell to hand, a lot of the time, I couldn't find anything that we actually do which it would be suitable for as a replacement for other ways that we can do it. So I haven't been using it for anything sort of day to day.
So I have a Windows machine here that is mostly for playing games when Sam's friends come over, and sometimes I want to do a Linuxy thing on it, and I had that this week, and I thought, well, I could reboot into Linux, or I could just leave it running Windows and just use this Ubuntu WSL thing. So I installed it on there, and I've installed it before, but never really used it in anger. But I used it to compile some software, and I used it to run an SSH server on there so that I could SSH into the Windows box, into the Linux part of the Windows box, which was quite fascinating, being able to SSH into my Windows machine. Well, the Linux part of a Windows machine, which was a bit weird, so that I could run like screen and like leave commands running on there remotely, which was pretty cool, which is something I've not really done on a Windows machine. I mean, you can with VNC, but it's a bit more clumsy. So I found it interesting and useful, but I found it incredibly slow. And I think that's one of the things they want to address in WSL 2, as I understand it.
Yes. So it sounds like, they're calling this, whereas WSL 1 was a compatibility layer, it was kind of like Wine, but in reverse. They're calling this lightweight virtualization. So it's actually doing more like, by the sound of it, when you're running an Ubuntu VM on Azure, it's actually running a full Linux stack on top of Windows.
That's interesting in itself, because the virtualization, the Hyper-V stuff, has traditionally only shipped in like the Pro versions of Windows, but they have found a way to enable just enough of Hyper-V to run on the home versions of Windows to enable WSL on the home versions too.
Oh, WSL works on home versions of Windows.
WSL 2 will work on the home versions, yeah.
That is interesting.
That is interesting and also a bit weird, because it's kind of aimed at like professional developer, and I don't know how many professional developers use Windows Home version 10. I don't know. Maybe some do. I was
surprised when I found that out. So yeah, but that's a thing apparently.
They must know. They must know how many of their users use what they, and determine what their requirements are. So there's been a lot of brouhaha about this, obviously, because it's Microsoft coming onto our turf and, talking about Linux and making it possible for people to run Linux-like software, Linux software on Windows. And some people see this as like the beginning of the end. It's now no reason at all for anyone to ever switch from Windows to Linux, because they don't need to, because this thing's going to ship Linux out of the box. You're going to have a kernel. You're going to be able to use apt or whatever distro you want to use on top, and nobody will ever switch to Linux again. Is that founded or unfounded, do you think?
I think this is Windows stepping onto Apple's turf. I think this is a play to steal the developer eyeballs from Mac OS and Apple Macs. Now that Microsoft have their Surface line of laptops, which by all accounts is very lovely hardware, and you will now be able to run a full Linux experience. I mean, Microsoft are providing the kernel, and then the various distributions who are, collaborating on this provide their user space. This, I think, is to attract that Mac developer audience back to Windows, just at a time when Apple are kind of fumbling their sort of pro-level developer, targeting.
That's an interesting thought. I hadn't heard that before, but it does make a lot of sense.
And one of the other things they talk about is integrated Windows file sharing capabilities are better for IDE. So I think this addresses the issue that you were talking about, Mark. So is this WSL2 going to be able to seamlessly move files between the two systems, or look at files, or write to files across both systems?
I haven't seen explicitly what this means, but it does sound like they're talking about that, some sort of, more native driver that handles both file systems from both sides, perhaps. But if it improves that kind of thing, and they're specifically talking about using IDEs, that is going to be really good. And, it's more likely that in my situation, at least, we'd actually be able to use it. Another thing I found interesting was in Canonical's announcement about Ubuntu support is talking about the things that are going to be supported, which includes Docker containers, Kubernetes, and snaps.
Oh. So
it sounds like they're actually going to support this at the same level it is supported running on Azure or anywhere else. So we're going to get the full fat Ubuntu experience on Windows.
Interesting. That will be weird because there'll be if you've got a Linux kernel running on Windows, and I imagine in order for all of those things to work and everything else that a normal Linux distribution uses, I guess it will probably have to have systemd as well, and all the other bits and pieces that make up the standard Linux stack. Are you going to have Pulse Audio running on there as well? It just boggles the mind as to what you could run on there. Like, really, pretty much anything that you could run on a Linux desktop. So I going back to the question I asked earlier, I can see why people are somewhat afraid of this eating their lunch, because for some people who want to try out some of these Linux applications, why would I bother reinstalling, or why would I bother going to the effort of spinning up a VM and go and get an ISO when I can just press get in the Microsoft Store and it does it all for me, and I don't have to do an awful lot, and I can still run that same software built in exactly the same way from the same archives, whether it's Docker containers or apt or snaps or whatever. Yeah, I can see why people are afraid of that. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I can see where the cautiousness comes from, and I suppose at the back of my mind I'm thinking, I hope this doesn't mean that. I don't think that that's Microsoft's agenda here, but they absolutely want to attract more developers to their desktop, and we run the risk, if we don't continue to provide a competitive desktop, we run the risk of people being attracted away, from Ubuntu on the desktop as well.
And this isn't just Microsoft wanting developers working on a Windows desktop. This is Microsoft wanting developers building and deploying to Azure.
Right.
They want people to have an environment on the Windows desktop that they can build, which is going to be the same thing they'll deploy to in Azure, because people run Ubuntu on Azure.
Ubuntu is very popular on Azure, so it makes sense that they want to provide that experience on a Windows workstation. You were talking about file sharing capabilities earlier. There's a feature available in an extension now. I think it's called Remote Development in Visual Studio Code, that enables you to connect your project to some sort of remote instance, be it a container or a VM or WSL, so you can actually do your development transparently, somewhere else.
I have used a feature similar to that in PHP Storm, which is the main IDE we use.
Right.
Because, in fact, I tried it in WSL where I had essentially an SSH server running and was accessing the files on the local machine, but over SSH. And as you can imagine, it adds a bit of overhead. So, yes, hopefully the new way of doing this, and it might be that that's the kind of thing they're talking about. It's going to be supporting the IDEs for doing this and knowing that that's what's going on.
Yeah.
That then improves the performance.
So the other suggestion that I've seen made is Microsoft are single-handedly making this the year of the Linux desktop, because in all likelihood, there are probably more developers running Windows machines running WSL. I have no idea what the numbers are, but if they've got this fully baked and it works super well, they could potentially have more developers, given how many they have, running this than there are total Linux, like traditional Linux desktop users.
I think it's inevitable, isn't it? I mean, they've got absolute like desktop operating system dominance, so they have the desktop part of that. And unlike WSL1, WSL2 does ship a Linux kernel. So yeah, Microsoft are going to bring it to the masses. The year of the Linux desktop for real this time, not the dress rehearsal we had a couple of years ago with WSL1.
So I can see why people are a bit twitchy about this, especially also because it's Microsoft. I don't know who else could do this. Like if someone else, if a third party created WSL, like I realize that's almost impossible for a third party to do because it's got tentacles hooked all the way into like the base of Windows. So I don't think anyone but Microsoft could have done this. But if someone else had done this, do you think we would have seen the same kind of vitriol that we see towards Microsoft? If it had been a third-party developer, like random Silicon Valley developers who've created this thing that costs $5 or maybe is even free up to a certain amount of disk space or RAM usage or something like that, and you just install it on your Windows workstation and it gives you Linux, do you think people would be Linux people would be as aggressive towards that third party as they would be towards Microsoft?
No, because I don't think they see, some startup in Silicon Valley as having the scale and momentum and marketing, punch that Microsoft does. I think people are nervous because Microsoft, despite what some people might have you believe, are still a massive industry influence.
Yes. Well, we are interested to hear what the community thinks about this, of course. So if you're a fan of WSL1, if you actually have found some useful things to do with it, then let us know. And if you're intrigued or terrified of WSL2, let us know why. You can email show@ubuntupodcast.org or drop into our Telegram channel at ubuntupodcast.org/telegram.
If you love the command line as much as we do, send us a command that will blow our minds, and we might even mention it on the show. Send your command line love to show@ubuntupodcast.org.
And now it's time for some command line love. And I think Alan found some love for us this week.
I did. And this one made me so happy because it solves a problem that I've needed a tool for in the past. And I found this on a blog post. And the command it uses awk and some weird esoteric characters that I have never seen used with awk. And the goal of it is to remove duplicate lines from a file, which, typically you might do using a tool like sort and unique. Is it unique or unique?
I always say unique.
You call it unique. Okay. So using those two tools, typically you would eliminate duplicate lines in a file. But what you sometimes want to do is remove duplicate lines, but keep the order of the lines in the file. So there might be some duplicates at the top and some duplicate lines down the bottom, but they're not touching each other. And so it needs to be able to remove all the duplicated entries, so you're only left with one instance of each type of line. And that's what this does. It removes duplicate lines from files while keeping the original order, so you don't sort it in any way. it's just a one-liner, and it's like 10 or 15 characters long, and that's it. And it's brilliant. And I found this incredibly useful because I had exactly this kind of data that I didn't want to sort and I didn't want to mess about with. And I didn't want to write a program that pulled all the lines in and then did the deduplication. And I found this and thought, this is magic. I need to make a note of this. And the easiest way to make a note of it is to put it in the show notes. And then I'll find it in a year's time when I next need that feature.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much.
We love getting your feedback. If you've got a comment about something you hear on the show, why don't you drop us an email on show@ubuntupodcast.org.
And now it's time for all your wonderful feedback. So, Alan, you go first. Gregory John emailed us at show@ubuntupodcast.org.
In the last show, Season 12, Episode 4, 2nd of May, 2019, you asked if we should be advocating for people to switch to Linux on the desktop. I was wondering if there's a possibility to advocate people to switch to Linux through gamification. You'll find short and incomplete mind map about Ubuntu gamification in the attachment. Oh, I haven't seen the attachment.
I've seen the attachment, made my mind hurt.
Didn't John O'Bacon do something a few years ago about gamification for new users on Linux?
Quite a long time ago, actually. I remember discussing this in Florida, so that would have been 2011.
Wow.
End of 2011. And yeah, it wasn't called Achievements, was it? It was called something else.
Karma in Launchpad.
No, this was baked into the desktop.
Oh.
The idea was that things you do would be analysed by his achievements system. Him and Stuart Langridge worked on it, and it would grant you these badges to say, oh, you've done your first code commit, or you've filed your first bug and stuff like that. And it would go and poke things in Launchpad or whatever to find out what achievements you had unlocked and, present them to you, and you'd get all these little badges. And it was a tricky time because there were some people who thought, yeah, this is a great idea and it's a great way to motivate people. But then other people were like super negative about it and said, I don't need badges. I'm not a Boy Scout and I'm not 12 years old. I don't need badges.
Nothing wrong with being a Boy Scout.
Or being 12 years old.
Or an achievement hunter.
But there's some people really do get value out of, magic internet beans or like points or badges or profiles. So I don't know. I think, yeah, there possibly is a room in this. And I've seen other platforms like Twilio, I think, have a thing like this where they have an achievement system. They have a whole, not just gamification, they have an actual RPG, a role-playing game of you logging into the account, and it's got all 8-bit pixel art. So there are some people who do this and do it really, really well. I don't know how well we would do it. Someone needs to make something and just make it happen, I think, for it to work.
Okay. Bill Smith emailed us.
Listening to your podcast, Season 12, Episode 5, I heard mention of Tree and something about index to HTML. I was able to apt install Tree, and when I ran it, I had 170 pages of disk content, but I have no idea how to index it to HTML. As a web designer, there are times where I would like to index printouts to HTML and save having to hardcode tables. Looking through the program notes on your website, I didn't see any reference to Tree anywhere. Would you please explain about indexing to HTML for me? Many thanks. The exact command is in the show notes for Season 12, Episode 4, and that's titled Ant Attack. And if you look in there, you'll find a command line love section with monospace font in red that's got the exact command you need to do this.
Perfect. Thanks, Martin. Soham Gomaste, I hope I got that right, emailed us regarding the Linux desktop hasn't done anything distinctive.
I'd like to point out a utility which is available only on the Linux desktop and in my opinion receives way less attention than it deserves. The said utility is none other than KDE Connect. It provides desktop phone integration at a level not seen before on any OS. On top of that, nothing ever leaves your local network. I feel most if not all the Ubuntu flavors, other than stock for GS Connect Ubuntu, should ship KDE Connect. I'm in mixed mind about this for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's a fantastic piece of software. It's great that it is possible to do this. And if I look at my little tray in the corner of my screen, I can see I actually am running KDE Connect on my KDE laptop, but I don't connect it to my phone because I just don't have any need for it. Because everything that can notify me of stuff on my phone notifies me on my laptop as well. And so I would end up duplicating my notifications. I'd get a Twitter notification on my phone, then I would get it on the desktop, and I would get the one from my phone on my desktop. So it would be pointless. The only thing that it would notify me of that I don't get notified already on my laptop is, well, two things really. One, phone and SMS. I never use my phone. I never send SMS and I almost never receive them. And secondly, game notifications when it's like, oh, your clan is falling apart. You need to play this game. I don't need that on my desktop. So I can see why it's a super useful tool. I just don't use it, and I don't know anyone who does.
I recently built the KDE Connect indicator in a PPA for everything from Bionic up, and it's built from a master snapshot that includes all the recent fixes. And this is the version that you can install on GTK-based desktops, so, you know, Mate and XFCE and the like. And I was evaluating it to determine whether I wanted to include it in the software boutique. And a bit like you, Alan, I couldn't find a compelling use case for it. When it first came out, it was the new hotness, but I don't use my phone to make many phone calls, and I certainly don't need that on my desktop. And I send and receive 0 text messages these days. So again, for me personally, it's of no real use. And I don't care for the use your phone as a mouse pad or control your music player from your phone. Not really interested. But maybe the listeners could educate us. You know, what are we missing about KDE Connect that's so amazing?
Ian Forbes emailed us.
What do you guys think about Intel Clear Linux? I confess I'd never heard of it until today, but is it something the other distros should be worried about?
Well, it's not just you who's only heard of it today.
Oh, right. This is new to you, is it?
Yes. What's Intel Clear Linux then?
Clear Linux is a Linux distribution created by Intel.
For Intel?
For Intel, yes. So I'm not very clear about what Clear Linux position is. I can't tell if it's like a tech demo or like a reference platform of this is how you tune your Linux distribution to thoroughly exploit all of the CPU features of Intel hardware, or if it is actually intended to be a going concern to compete with other distributions.
So they have somewhere around 4,000 packages in their archive. Now, obviously not everything is in there, but there's a lot of stuff that is in there. And I've seen a few people, I've seen it mentioned online a bit recently. I think Jason Evangelo talked about it recently. He made an article in Forbes. And I mean, I'm aware of it because Ike Doherty from Solus used to work on it before he worked on Solus and now works on it again. Now he's back at Intel. And so I'm aware of it through that. And I've certainly installed it, but I was kind of meh because I didn't use it as my default desktop. I think maybe if I used it as my default desktop, maybe I might appreciate the performance benefits. I don't know. But given how much crud I have on my system, I think I would probably end up loading it up with the same rubbish and it would still perform in exactly the same way. Boot really fast, and then I would load it up with rubbish. So I don't know. I think we'll have to wait and see. I don't know about... I'm always a bit dubious about the Intel open source division because they seem to be all over the place, and I've seen many of their other products. I own a couple of the products that they've created in the past that never went anywhere and were barely shipped to like hundreds, let alone thousands of people. So I'm not entirely convinced this will go anywhere, but hard to know.
Peter Newton emailed us.
So now, today, we're facing the prospect of the introduction of Windows 10 subsystem for Linux, incorporating a true Linux kernel in WSL2. This worries me. The question I'm now asking myself is this: has the attack surface been increased with regards to Linux? Is this part of a preemptive, underhanded strategy to invite the opportunities black hat to cause havoc on Linux systems? After 6 years of Linux use, I am by no means an expert, but unless I'm missing some fundamental security knowledge here, I would say that this is a cause for concern.
No, it's not.
No, there are two thoughts I had when I read this. The first was, okay, yes, maybe more people are running Linux on their machines, so it might encourage people to target Linux more. But the idea that this is part of an unhanded strategy to intentionally get people to attack Linux, from presumably he's suggesting that Microsoft are doing this to be evil, but Microsoft run Linux on Azure and sell Linux to people on Azure, and they don't want people compromising it because then that would make them less money.
It's a little tinfoil hatty, I think. Maybe.
Ulrich Dorder emailed us.
Having been annoyed by having to fix Windows installs again and again, I installed Ubuntu LTS on the laptops of two probably most tech unsavvy persons I know, my mother and my girlfriend's mother. All they need is Firefox, Thunderbird, LibreOffice, printing and scanning, and so far it's been without any issues for more than a year. While it has never been needed so far, I am a bit worried in case something should break in the future. Given that I live about 1,000 kilometers away, remote assistance is essential. While I know of TeamViewer, I prefer fully open source software and wonder what tools you are using for this purpose. I created a small Python script which I placed on their desktop background, and then all they have to do is double click it, which is about the maximum I can ask them to do. The script starts a teammate session, that's teammate.io, and a video call on jitsi.org, and then sends me the link via good old email. Once I receive this, I can either fix stuff directly via the command line or start a reverse SSH session to one of my Raspberry Pis to allow X2Go sessions. While this does the job for me at the moment, I still wonder if there is a better way to do this. Wow, that's quite the impressive solution. The way that I do this is I use remote VNC connections. So this is the means by which I have ports on my router at home configured that allow a connection for VNC to be remotely initiated and displayed on my screen. So a similar system where I put icons on people's desktops that they can click, and if they click that, I see the remote session on an already running remote VNC endpoint that I start on my workstation. And the advantage is that unless I actually start my remote endpoint at my house, when they click on that link, it doesn't do anything.
I just used to SSH. I would just have a thing running on my mum's computer, which would ping a box that I had control over, so I would know what her IP address was. So it would just do an HTTP GET periodically, so I knew what her IP address was if it changed, and I could just SSH in, and I would just use SSH, and if I needed to, I would tunnel VNC over that.
Torin Doyle posted a comment on our website.
Instead of the Librem 5, I'd be more tempted to jump from my Android device, first and last time I buy an Android phone, to Ubuntu Touch, with a compatible device like the Fairphone 2. Yeah, that's a nice idea. If that works for you, do it.
And maybe later this year, you'll also have the option to use the Pine phone. Check in with the UB Ports guys to see how they're getting on with that.
Yes, it would be nice if there was a sort of new phone that you could get Ubuntu Touch running on rather than having to dig around for phones from the past. Finally, something I'd like to share on a personal note. We had some feedback in the Telegram channel after I mentioned on a previous show that my partner and I were expecting a baby. Somebody asked if there would be some sort of way for listeners to contribute to buying things for the baby, which was wholly unexpected and extremely touching. So I set up a GoFundMe page, which was the best way I could think to do this, and we'll have a link in the show notes. I'm absolutely not expecting this. So, anything at all is far more than enough. But if anybody wants to do this, then you're very welcome to, and we'll post updates of the things we use the money to buy. It's not due till November, so we might wait a bit before we actually buy some of the stuff. But yes, just thank you everyone who thought of this and everyone who's given money already. It's just really amazing. And that's all for episode 8. Thank you very much for listening. We don't know what we're going to be talking about next time. I suspect we'll have some news and community news and events as usual. You can find us in the meantime in our Telegram channel at ubuntupodcast.org/Telegram. Well, anything else you guys would like to mention before we go?
No, we're going to be in Montreal soon. So we might have to have some report from there at some point in the future.
Oh, well, that'll be nice for you.